Ladies and gentlemen, we are live on Magnetic Reversal News with Robert Burke and my lovely partner, Leah Shaper. And this may have been on Oppenheimer Ranch Project, but it can't be because we got a community guideline strike and we can't publish, we can't even message our supporters until the beginning of November. So it's absolutely YouTube's way of sticking their foot up the of people that are exposing the truth. And we have Robert Burke with us, a very special guest tonight that is an independent researcher that is coming live from the Northwoods of the United States. And he's got some interesting theories on the younger Dryas utilizing electric universe. So welcome to the show, Robert.
Thank you, David. Thank you, Leah. It's very good to be here this evening.
And we're going to discuss, and I'll just click over to it here. I think this is one of your major graphics. Is this a good picture to start on?
Actually, if you have a picture of the near impact, which is the Himalayan mountain chain, even just on Google Earth, that would probably be the best place to start from.
Okay, yeah, I can definitely go there. So let me just bring up some Google Earth here. How about that?
So one of the things that I talk about in my thesis, and what we're here to talk about tonight about the Younger Dryas impact event, is that the event is extant in all of the data collection that we have out there, talking about things like the Lachamp excursion, the Younger Dryas event, the various sphericals, the nanodiamonds. All of these can be explained through high pressure electrical arcing. And once we decide that there is an architecture that can be utilized here to describe the event, then we can better identify whether or not the model fits the thesis of a cataclysm. And so what I did when I was first looking at this was I said, well, one, I came to the issue through the electric universe, which is the Thunderbolts project, and a couple of other researchers such as Billy Yelverton, Andy Hall. And, these people were talking about electrical discharges that you could see in the surface of the Earth and that they were modeling it in the lab. And I believe I'd heard the comment, that rivers had a shape known as a Lichtenberg figure, and that rivers were likely formed in a discharge. And if you look at the Mississippi River Basin, it does have a perfect Lichtenberg structure to it. And you see that exact same Lichtenberg structure in the Amazon River, in the Yangtze River. And you see that structure, except slightly different in the Nile, and that's because it was a direct discharge, but in a direct current way. These are all identifiable characteristics that have electrical origins. So, we use this transitive effect of same self-similar form. The rivers look like electrical discharges, and it isn't that I just say, ergo, they are electrical discharges. If they are, then all of that electricity should be going in a certain direction. There should be a current, and that current would create a circuit. And so we have to first and foremost identify where is this current coming from. And my thesis is based on three things. The first one being that we live in an electric universe. The second one is that the cataclysm itself is encoded in mythology across our planet. You can look at myth after myth after myth, and you can identify the key concepts of the cataclysm from both before, during, and after the event. And then the third part is identifying that Venus was the celestial object that we had a near impact with. And that's why I begin with the near impact site in the Himalayan mountains in the Tarim Basin. There's a paper that was written, and that paper, I should have sent you that link, I apologize. But this paper was written that actually laid out the characteristics of what a meteor impact should look like. And part of that included modeling it through doing solid impact of rock on surfaces, in different discharge surfaces. And after doing this, they came up with a list of things that you would expect to see in a near impact site. And it turned out that what you should get is a round cone surface, a peak apex, if it was moving, and that you should have a long streak pattern if it came in at an angle. And I would be remiss if I didn't say the only reason no one has looked at this crater, this scarring in the surface of the Earth, and identified it as a near impact site is the sheer size of the event. You would have to imagine Venus, which is 95% the size of the Earth, as coming in close contact with the Earth. That would be a huge event that should leave a huge mark in the surface of the Earth. And that huge mark and that huge event is evident in the scar we see as the Himalayan mountains and the Tarim Basin, which is the brown streak in the middle. And I always like to point to Carl Sagan because, Sagan famously said, look, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Well, great. Mount Everest is in the rim of what I am claiming to be the near impact site. And if it is, you should find the highest point on the planet, the most extraordinary point on the planet, as evidence of an extraordinary event.
Now, this is a great theory or hypothesis, but the only problem is that all of the younger Dryas impactor proxies, none of them are found in this region. And there is a region called the Younger Dryas Impact Zone. And let me just pull that up here. And we'll share that so we can take a look. Now, all the incidents of nanodiamonds, microspherules, tektites, we've got multiple types of nanodiamonds, including Lonsdaleite. We've got magnetic grains, shocked quartz, and every single impactor showing up stratigraphically exactly at 12,828 plus or minus 20. And they're only within this Younger Dryas impact field. None of them are in the Himalayas. And in fact, these researchers that did the work in 2014 went across the entire globe to all of the stratigraphy that it shows this the Younger Dryas time period, and took samples at them. And that's how they came up with this impact field. So what would your explanation be for this being the Younger Dryas event if none of the proxy data are in the Himalayas? And additionally, if you're working off of Velikovsky said specifically that Venus was ejected out of Jupiter around 2000 BC and then made two close flybys here on Earth at around 1500 BC, which is nowhere near the Younger Dryas event.
No, and outside of the fact that the story of Atlantis places the cataclysm at about the same period, I'm really skeptical of a 12,900 years ago event, in part because that's just a lot of years to go through. Not that it couldn't, and I don't have to get tied up on an exact year when it happened, but
well, actually,
I think
the sinking of Atlantis occurs at 11,005, which is exactly the end of the Younger Dryas, when sea level rises around 330 feet. And we're talking about the GISP-2 data, if you're looking at the ice core data.
Sure. No, and I understand that, when we look at these ice core data, one of the things we have to look at more specifically is, well, let's start with your diagram here. So you've pulled this out and you've said, hey, Bob, look at this. So what I'd like you to note here about this diagram is that the eastern side of this diagram actually meets directly up in front of the near impact site. And so if you know anything about electricity, and electricity charge, that is the thing that people call the positive side on a battery, the charge is going one direction in the circuit while the current is moving in the other direction in the circuit. And so what this is showing you is the direction of energy moving, which is not in the direction you think it is. It's going in the opposite direction. It's going from west to east because that's the direction that the current was flowing in the cataclysm. This is an example of a sail. So I'm a sailor, and that's one of the things that you learn about sails. And if you fly, you learn the same thing about a wing, right? So a sail or a wing does not work because air is pushed into the front to the back, is pushed into your sail. You are not pushed along by the wind. The wind hits the sail, but on the front side of the sail, it creates low pressure, and that low pressure pulls the sailboat along. What this is showing you is this is showing the pull of that material from the cataclysm itself.
So I
And
guess
you
we
still
need
say
to.
it's Venus. So what do you? Go ahead, Leah.
Well, I was going to say, I mean, one of the things that we would need to address is if we're looking at the Himalayan impact site, do we have any geological information about when that happened, for one? And then my other question is your proposal that Venus actually hit Earth, or that it was a plasma contact?
So I have always used the terminology that it was a near impact. And the reason that I say it was a near impact is twofold. One, when we're talking about an electric universe, everything is scalable. Whatever is true at the smallest level is also true at the largest level. And this was huge, right? In real physics, nothing ever really touches each other. That's just kind of a rarely covered fact of the physical universe people don't know. And so when a ball bounces off the ground, the ball doesn't actually really touch the ground. The ball is reflected by an electromagnetic force known as self-capacitance. The electricity, the energy of the ball is absorbed, and then it's retransmitted back to the ball, causing it to bounce off, just like a golf ball does on a green, which is really what we're talking about here. All of that process is electric in nature, and we know that. When a car goes around a corner, right, that pressure you feel is electric. That inertia is electric has long since been established. And so any change in direction would be electric in nature. Again, we're back at an electric universe explanation where all of the elements to tell what happened are built into our daily lives. If you've ever played golf, near impact, divot.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, yeah, atoms are mostly space, right? So I get that concept. So then the question would be is what was the force that formed this crater? And then again, I do think we need some geological information about the strata in the crater. Diamond, do you know anything about this region?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. There are fascinating and very odd things about this location that further confirm an electric event. For example, in the Tarim Basin itself, geologists have no idea why, but the entire ground has been moved and turned 45 degrees. 45? It might be 26. In any case, the whole ground turned. It actually turned counterclockwise. I want to say we'll call it 30 degrees. That turning is what happens when a charge goes in the ground. The charge rotates an inductive force in a counterclockwise manner. The charge went into the earth as it was nearing impact with the earth. That's the nature of electricity. The other things that it did is it created a huge amount of what they call microplates. There's also a giant bolus of silicone and ridges underneath that are all bowed like a bowl. And they think, well, hey, this must have been a sea somewhere in the past. And it isn't that it was a sea. In electrical arcing, these are very normal layerings that occur during the exchange of energy. And so once again, we're using standard electric terminology, things that are used every day in manufacturing. And we're saying, Bob, what does this look like? And the Tarim Basin looks like an electrical discharge crater. One of the other interesting things is that we know that there is a connection between the South Atlantic oscillations and the amount of rain that'll happen up in the Tarim Basin and I believe in the Himalayan mountains. And it's called the South Atlantic Oscillation. So how do you get an oscillation that picks up the Atlantic Ocean all the way into the Tarim Basin? And the answer is that those two are linked by the event. The Tarim Basin was the high pressure location for the impact, And the Atlantic Ocean actually is the low impact, the low pressure zone on the other side. That is the sail sucking from the surface out.
So if we were to link this basin to the Younger Dryas impact zone, is essentially you're proposing that like a lot of the material that is found in the Younger Dryas impact zone was thrown from this position, essentially?
Not well, in front of it, and if you want to go in closer, you can see in front of the image that what you're really dealing with is just like once again a golf ball hitting the ground on a green. If it has a lot of spin, which they both did, it would kick up some of the grass and dirt and throw it in front of it. Well, that's the nature of a meteor impact. Again, there is a study out there that talks about what should it look like, and you should have ejecta to the front side of your impact.
The huge problem here is that there is no evidence that this is an impact. None geologically. In fact, this basin is referred to as one of the largest petroleum repositories on Earth. So it's a sedimentary basin that had subsequent huge magmatic episodes. And these are what the pyroclastic flows around the periphery consist of. It's dated at tertiary, meaning it was deposited millions and millions of years ago. And so it's a flat-lying basin that hasn't been undisturbed. In fact, the exact opposite of an impact site. Not only that, there are no nanodiamonds, no shock quartz, and no evidence of any impact at this region anywhere.
Like I said, the issue most people have is that they can't imagine an event this large. And if you scroll back out from where you're at here on
this is an impact, so even imagining one this large doesn't matter. You need evidence of an impact.
So if you'll scroll out a little bit further, let's take a look at the broader area. Let's look at the broader area. Okay. And if you do, you'll notice that you have the elongated cratering that you would have if a ball were coming in.
Right.
I am only pointing. Well,
you're talking. Your evidence is a shape. That is what a third grader would say. You need to have cosmogenic evidence. You need radionucleotides. You need shocked quartz. You need microtectites. None of this are in this region. So how in the world, and even if you're claiming that Venus is in close proximity and there's plasma discharging, we would have all of this. We would have plasma pitting, and we would have all of the discharge proxies that we see in the Younger Dryas Basin. We see an increase in beryllium-10, which is only formed from cosmic rays in space. So they're raining down on this region. Why are they not raining down on this region?
Well, they are. I'm going to send you a link so that you can pull a paper up for everybody here. And the reason I'm sending the link, and it's important, is that it provides people with sorry about this. It provides people with what you're looking for, which is a description, an academic description of what the near impact crater should look like. And so if you go through that description, and it's a simple thing to do, we don't have to create a brand new way of looking at the world. This paper tells us, what is this supposed to look like?
Okay, so you could send me all the papers all day what an impact looks like, but I'm going to tell you that if you get something that looks like an impact and then you go there and you do sampling, you find all kinds of evidence of cosmogenic origin. And none of that is here, which is not an impact.
So one of the things that's
nothing until you get on the ground as a geologist and you sample the region, which they did. They sampled the whole Earth in 2014 to delineate the Younger Dryas impact field. And within the field, they found all of the cosmogenic precursors, beryllium, microspherules, nanodiamonds, shock quartz, on and on. But none of that is in the impact field. So this is not part of the Younger Dryas cosmogenic event. Whatever shape or whatever paper you pull up to say that this shape could be an impact, there's no evidence that it's an impact during the Younger Dryas. Leah, do you have something to add?
Well, I basically agree with you, Diamond. Without the without the geology, I'm just going to call it that in short, the nanodiamonds, the microspherules, all of that. If that's not there, then I don't know that we can call this an impact. I mean, this is kind of a small, not really an analogy, but I was thinking earlier today about, I've spent some time looking on, well, we both have spent a lot of time looking on Google Earth for plasma scarring, and we found it in many places, or so we think. And one of the things I was thinking about was the Ozarks. The Ozarks have a very, clear plasma discharge pattern. However, I would never feel comfortable calling it that unless there was a specific set of geological proxies that we could point to that we should find at a plasma scarring event, and then we actually went and looked. So I wouldn't base it on alone.
No, but what we're still dealing with is the question of the near impact. And what's unfortunate, David, is that I'm asking for just a moment to read what academics have said. If we were to fire a meteor at another body, what would the characteristics look like? And the question is, do the characteristics outlined in the paper meet the criteria laid out in my near impact? This is basic science. We shouldn't be saying that your near impact, Bob, is not the younger Dryas. What we should be saying is, what should we be looking for in the data, and does the data match the impact site? The top of the data says, quote, most impacts occur at an angle with respect to the horizontal plane. I am presenting exactly that, and that is exactly what the scar displays. The next part says, this is primarily reflected in the ejecta distribution. Yes, ejecta distribution should occur in front of it. And you can see a clear line of the rock and the ejecta moving in front of the object's impact and not to the left and right. These are natural formations of a near impact. Unfortunately, impact craters with pristine ejecta, but at very low angle, structural asymmetries, such as an elongation of the crater and non-radial development of the central peak, become apparent. This is describing the very middle of the Tarim Basin. You have an asymmetrical peak created because this was on a low trajectory as it came in. Well, it was on a slanted trajectory rather than coming straight down. All of the evidence laid out in this paper meets the evidence in the near impact zone I've provided.
I think the problem is that there's more data than that would be needed to talk about an impact, like what Diamond was mentioning. All of these other materials that we normally find at impact. I mean, if the shape matches, that's great. But without the other materials, I don't know that we can really determine that this is an impact, because it's not like an event like this would simply cause a dent of a certain size. There's also the material aspect. And that's what we're missing here.
Well, let me give you another example of the electrical nature of the event and how some craters are miscategorized as impact craters, when in fact what they are they're negative discharge craters. So in 2016, I believe it was, they found a 36-mile crater in Greenland, right? This big round circle. And if you'd like, you can go on Google Earth and take a look at it. You're welcome to. It's just right up in the corner there. You can see the arc of it.
We're actually just talking about the
Hiawatha crater
in the last 2 days.
And so
the newest paper that just came out 4 months ago dates the crater quite specifically to 48.9 million years ago. And
I'm sure they aged the rock, and you can't age the rock.
They were using the shocked zircon. It's a very specific type of X-ray fluorescence.
Yeah. So give me a moment here. Give me a moment. I'm going to show you something. So if you were to put,
and here we're looking at a meteor crater, which doesn't look anything like your crater, and actually has all the evidence, cosmogenic evidence of impact, including microspherules, shock quartz, and other cosmogenic signatures.
There's no ejecta. David, you're missing this. There's no ejecta on this. You're missing all of the ejecta from this. It's not laying around this. It's not laying in front of it. It's not laying behind it. There's no ejecta in this, David.
There's multiple papers on the ejecta on meteor crater.
No,
You can see
I'm
piles
looking
of
at
it.
the picture,
You can
and
see
there's
piles
no.
of it around the edge. Most of this hole is displacement on the rim.
Yep.
Most of the volume is on the curvature up here. This actually rises 1,000 feet on the rim. So there's not a lot of ejecta. There's just deformation of the surface.
Well, since we have the conservation of energy, that means that when it was ejected, that all of the material that was in the middle should be around the outside, and that amount of material is not there. Nor is the cone-shaped requirement that lists the asymmetrical cone
The
that they
missing
talk about.
space in the hole is taken up by the rim in the impact.
No,
Do you
this
understand
thing's
what I'm
much deeper.
saying?
I do. There's still not enough material there. But let's
Yeah, you
let's
need an
stop for just
extra
a moment.
18%, and that's scattered around the rim.
Let's go take a look at the Greenland crater, and I want to show you something that I found that's very interesting and puts these in a better perspective. So if you'd head over to Google Earth for just a moment and head to the crater in northern Greenland, I'm going to show you 3 specific round craters, perfectly round craters, and how they all line up in a perfect line. And that's important for us to do because when we're talking about data, right, we're looking at creating trends and understanding what's happening from trends. And I'm going to show you that there are 3 perfectly circular craters, one in line with another, and that's because these 3 craters represent a negative discharge. That's why they line up in a perfect order. Are we able to get to Google Earth? There we go. So if you go to, yeah, there you go, go up to Greenland, and way up where the, yep, up and where the channels meet in northwest Greenland, you can see the arc of the rim. Yeah, there we go. It's right there. Yep, you're right on it to your left, and that's it. Okay. So that's the very first circle. That's 36 miles across. And once again, it is a perfect circle. And as we just read in this peer-reviewed paper, most impacts occur at an angle. And this one is perfectly round, suggesting it came from directly above. Now, if you go directly south of that, you will see that there is another formation. And I actually, if you'll go south from here, David. Yep, keep going. Straight south of there. And, you know, anybody on the call can, on the show can, you know, review this a little later. Keep going south. Here we go. So right there in the middle, you have a second one. You have a Cone Island, and then you have the Hudson Bay. So if you were to go, well, that's a third one, but that's actually a fourth one. We're going to go out a little bit, and we're going to stop and look at the Hudson Bay. So if you were to draw a line from the crater in Greenland straight down to the middle of the islands in the Hudson Bay called the Belcher Islands, you will find that there is another circle directly in the middle of that.
Well, it's off to the right. It's off to the
No,
right. It's not in
no,
the
actually, if you want to do the math on it and you want to drop a ruler in the middle of the one in Greenland and go down to the middle of the one in the Hudson Bay, I promise you, you're going to go directly through the center of the other round depression. These are 3 negative discharges.
But I'll let you,
David.
So none of these are younger Dryas craters. So why are we discussing these 3 circles?
Because I'm trying to explain that what you're calling impact craters, of which we really haven't found an impact crater, they're all actually electrical discharge craters. They're not impact craters.
We're well aware. We're well aware.
None of them
if you
are at an
watched
angle.
Our last podcast, what our claim is that the younger Dryas impact field is in fact the region where a large comet from the Taurid meteor streams broke up around 20,000 years ago in the inner solar system. And huge amounts of objects made its way around the sun and started impacting the sun at the end of the bowling Allarod around 14,500 years ago, which started to cause outbursts on the sun and cooling on the planet. And the reason the cooling occurred was because the sun outbursts actually heated the auroral belts because of solar proton events called, coronal mass ejections.
Mhm.
And they started melting the ice. And these melts have 3 meltwater pulses until the third pulse that we call the Younger Dryas is when some of these objects that were circling the sun were flung out and began hitting Venus, our planet, and the moon. And the reason we know they hit the moon is because in the same exact layers, there's over 26 sites where there's lunar material within the Younger Dryas field exactly on that layer. Now, many people have claimed that this lunar material is just lunar material that falls on Earth all the time and was washed there, which is completely ludicrous. So our hypothesis is the Younger Dryas field, which is filled with this proxy cosmogenic material. That's the only place these impactors can be coming in. None of them hit the surface. They all discharged above the surface. And the reason we say this is because all of the scientific evidence of all of the objects coming into Earth we know of, none of them hit Earth.
No, they don't. Do you know why? Do you know why?
They all discharge above the surface.
No. See, that's the problem with the hypothesis, David, is that you don't have any evidence that that's what happens. So here's what we do have evidence for if the event is electrical.
Wait a minute. We don't have evidence that these objects the Chelt Glints, we have video of it discharging 2 kilometers above the surface.
Hold on. So what I'm talking about is the Tunguska event. And what we don't have in the Tunguska event is a meteor that left any debris whatsoever that explains why the entire forest was leveled for hundreds of miles around.
Yeah,
right?
It was vaporized at 7 kilometers above the surface. And if you do the thermodynamics, it's so specific. Oh, Robert left.
No, he didn't. Your mic is off, Robert. Robert, your mic is off.
His mic isn't connected, so he pulled it out.
So he can't hear me either.
Nope.
Can you hear me say that your mic is off?
Robert, your mic is off. Your mic is unplugged, Robert. No, because he's using a headset. He can't hear our audio.
Yeah, I know. Your mic is Your mic is off. Your mic is off.
What should we do here?
I don't know. I'm
I'm going to remove him from the stream. He'll get the clue. I just took him out of the stream, so he's got to re-sign in. Can you still hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Yeah. He figured it out.
Did I get lost again?
You were unplugged.
For like 5 minutes, bro.
Your headset was unplugged or something. Your mic was off. We were trying to tell you, but you couldn't hear us.
I apologize. I'll summarize that real quick. What we're really looking at when we're looking at not just the Venus event, but the Tunguska event, is that the discharge comes from the ground up. It's the doorknob analogy. When you're shocked in the middle of the winter, that shock doesn't actually come from you to the doorknob. The doorknob shocks you. In a near impact hypothesis, such as the Tunguska and the Venus cataclysm, the Earth shocked the incoming meteor and vaporized it. And that's why there was a cone blowout around Tunguska, and why there seems to be at Lake Chenko a crater. But there's no material. There's no near impact material. There's a lake, but they don't know why it's there. It's there because it discharged out, and in its discharge, it disintegrated the meteor.
That's exactly what I said, Robert. That Leah and I don't believe that there's anything that's hitting the surface of the Earth. These are all discharges above the surface.
Yeah, no.
Now, in your case, you're claiming that Venus didn't hit Earth and made this elongated impact, quote unquote, without impacting. So
well,
the electromagnetic field of Venus versus the Earth, what happened is that the Earth's discharge ionized Venus, which is why it doesn't have a magnetic field anymore. And that ionization flooded the planet with electrons, which is why the planet has an acidic environment and why it has a pH of about negative 1.2 or something like that. Venus is a giant ball of electrons, and those electrons came from the discharge in the cataclysm. It also, in that ionization, flipped Venus upside down and left it in a retrograde spin. Again, all of these are simple electrical explanations and things that we have used in electrical science for a very long time.
I don't think either of us are suggesting that there's not electrical phenomena involved. I mean, we're both pretty familiar with electric universe theory. I think the biggest problem we're having is that like in the case of the Tibetan crater, there's a lack of geochemical evidence, which we do find elsewhere on Earth. So why is it elsewhere where we've had either impacts or plasma discharge events? It almost doesn't matter in the conversation anymore because both of those present geochemical evidence.
It's both.
But that's not found in Tibet.
It's geochemical and geophysical. So we've literally scoured every single paper for all the Younger Dryas event. We followed the narrative since the Firestone 2007. We discussed the first discovery of the microspherules in 2013, and then the amazing dissertation-like papers that came out from Wendy Kolbosh in 2 parts. That's literally hundreds of pages of data. And what they did was all of the scientists that didn't believe in the Firestone paper, they were all around the world. And they said, you know what? Let's go to the stratigraphy, to that site. We'll sample that site everywhere. And we're going to prove this MFer wrong. We're going to do it. And they did it. And they took thousands of samples independently. And they sent them through 8 of the highest resolution electron microscopy, every type of X-ray fluorescence, any type of analysis to find everything, including all of the proxies for cosmogenic origin. And that's how they came up with the Younger Dryas impact field, because only the cosmogenic precursors existed in that region. And ironically enough, the paleontology supports it. So paleontologically, and I hate to break this to you, Robert, there was no change in the fauna in that region of the basin in China during that time period. So all the animals were the same throughout the Younger Dryas over there. And so apparently they could handle the impact. But over in the Younger Dryas impact field, 68% of the megafauna died. And the Clovis people were completely eliminated from the coast of North America in an instant, in a single day. And so when you look at the geochemical, the geophysical data in finding the microspherules, the tektites, and the nanodiamonds, then you have to start to wonder what happened, because there's no impactors in this Younger Dryas field. What we do have is we have a desert southwest with all the.
I found an impactor. I found my thesis has a near impact site. I have a location for this thing to start from. That's the difference in our thesis. I've listened and I've heard you specifically state 4 or 5 or 6 different events that have occurred. And most of those are based on chemical rock analysis. And many of them have good analysis have good basis in data. You're pointing at, changes that occurred in the rock strata, and in particular, how they occurred in terms of being part of the ionosphere and upper high stratosphere of the Earth. Absolutely. Look, in a Venus cataclysm scenario, these 2 bodies had magnetospheres that were much larger than the planets. And the electrical connection between the 2 planets was immense. We're talking about billions of kilojoules. These are not.
Yeah. So why are there no cosmogenic markers over your impact? They should all be there. They shouldn't be over to the east. They shouldn't be over in California, 3,000 miles away. There needs to be a cosmogenic signature. If Venus was in close proximity to that basin, it would be littered with evidence. There would be massive amounts of beryllium-10, shock quartz, microspherules just from the plasma discharge. Why aren't they there?
Well, for one, we're describing two different locations. Again, mostly your locations are discharge sites, electrical discharge sites, whereas mine is the near impact site. And so we're dealing with microcontinental plates. We're talking about silicone basins underneath the near impact site. We're talking about the highest point on the planet. If you zoom in and you look at the Himalayan mountain chains, you'll notice that the mountain chains themselves look just like Lichtenberg figures, and that's because they are Lichtenberg figures, which are electrical in nature. They were formed in a positive charge during the cataclysm. When they have the similar form of electricity in them, they're electric in nature, and they were formed as the outer rim of the magnetospheres coming together. Electrical formations are normal and recognizable.
Leah, you want to take it?
I just feel like I'm repeating myself. I mean, I completely agree that electrical scarring, for example, is very recognizable. I completely agree with that. But in order to have a cohesive theory, we do need the geochemical and the geophysical markers as well.
So one of the areas that I've done a lot of research on are the Great Lakes here in North America. And if you look at the Great Lakes for just a moment and you kind of step back wide enough and you look at them, one of the things that you'll notice very quickly, if you're looking for it, is that Lake Superior actually very much looks like the head of a bird. And that you have the body of a bird in Lake Michigan and Lake Huron. And then you have Lake Erie and Lake Ontario on the bottom, which are really kind of like 2 feet. This area of North America is prime for the Thunderbird mythology. And in fact, the area in Wisconsin known as Devil's Lake, Wisconsin, actually has a Thunderbird effigy at the location. It points west. And not only does it have a rock effigy to the Thunderbird there, but if you stand at that lake, which is way up on a hill, it's called an endorheic lake. There's nothing flows into it and nothing flows out of it. And the glaciers didn't form it because it's too high. So nobody knows how it was formed. That's the thing about endorheic lakes. It has a perfect L in it. The eastern side points perfectly north-south, and the other side points perfectly east-west. And if you turn and you went perfectly east from Devil's Lake, Wisconsin, you end up at the corner of Lake Ontario as it comes into the river that joins the two and Niagara Falls. These two areas are areas of electrical exchange that formed what's known as a gun diode. And if you understand how the circuitry of the global electric circuit formed in the cataclysm, David, you can explain, and Leah, you can explain the entire topography of the planet. And so there were no individual events. You can define every square inch of the planet, and you can, to a degree, say what happened after the cataclysm, because, well, for example, the Mississippi River formed in the cataclysm. Anything that happened after the cataclysm should be fairly apparent because it won't have the same form as the Mississippi itself. These are the types of events that we're talking about that are electrical and that are modelable.
Well, a lot of the Thunderbird motifs are petroglyphs that are 800 to around 1,200 years old. And if Leah and I have seen millions of them, I've seen actually millions. Leah has seen slightly less. But the point being is that most of the Thunderbird motifs are recent, and most of the plasma discharge motifs are recent. And we've connected those to events like potentially the event in 775, which is a carbon spike known as the Charlemagne event. And then we have the Hopewell airburst, where there's been major studies that have only happened recently that an airburst was witnessed by the Hopewell people, which is probably a torrid bolide. It happened in the fall. Imagine that. And then as they witnessed it, they got destroyed. And there's evidence of vitrification in Hopewell villages because this bolide, as they were in all of it coming towards them, discharged above them and literally. And then the most recent Tunguska paper that Lee and I looked into, using the thermodynamics and the dimensions, they estimate that the center of the airburst, because in the center of the airburst, the trees weren't obliterated. Those were the most preserved. It was only the perimeter. And the supposition is that based on the thermodynamics, the discharge created temperatures approaching the sun temperatures, like 10,000 C, and it evaporates all the air for, miles out, and nothing, it gets charred on the outside, of course, but nothing can burn after the event, similar to what happened with the Hopewell. And anyone that was nearby or underground or in a sweat lodge might have lived. So similar to the Younger Dryas event where the Clovis were decimated on the whole continent, this is a smaller event. It's a mini Younger Dryas event from an entering single bolide that may have discharged over the Hopewell. And this could just add to the Thunderbolts motif that the natives had in their minds from the past and then been reinforced here at another event.
Well, I think that there should be an open discussion about different theses and different theories about how these may have formed. But, again, if you take just a moment, and I would suggest, and I hope that folks will take a moment to go look at some videos on my channel that I'm sure it'll be posted somewhere here. One of my videos, which I shared with you originally, is the story of the Thunderbird and a warrior called Bluefeather. And what we find in our mythology is that most of our really global myths, if you will, actually share much of the information that we need to know about the cataclysm itself. And so the Thunderbird mythology begins by telling us about a flood, and then tells us about a green fog that descended, and then talks about how giant columns of water were brought up. This story tells a play-by-play Thunderbird occurrence. And as you look at the shape of the Great Lakes, and in particular, there are some odd formations, such as the angle at the Lake Huron's northeast corner, right? If you look at that angle, it's a hexagonal shape, and that hexagonal shape is actually formed in a memristive state, which is a memristive state is an electrical circuit that, well, it creates an electrical pattern for managing chaotic electrical charges. And when you can identify these electrical formations around the Earth, again, you have fidelity of model proving that, this occurred here. If I have a gun diode formed in the Great Lakes, the current has to come from someplace, and it has to be going someplace. And that's the fidelity that I'm offering in a Younger Dryas Venus cataclysm hypothesis.
Are you suggesting that the Thunderbird shape that you're seeing in the Great Lakes is the origin of the Thunderbird myth?
Yes.
Because that would presume that people living there had the ability to get a bird's eye view of the lakes, which I'm not saying is impossible. I mean, we've seen other things like that, for example, the Nazca lines in the Southwest, but it does require that.
No. Actually, the Thunderbird was, look, the mythology of the Thunderbird was that this thing was huge. And so people go, pterodactyls were huge. No, again, Thunderbird, we're talking about coast of North America to Canada. We're talking.
So how did they see that? How did people see that?
They looked up, and when they looked up from what we would call it a most likely somewhere around South Dakota, when they looked up to the east, they saw the Thunderbird in front of them as part of the discharge of the gun diode current.
Sure.
Right?
But then what is the connection to the Thunderbird shape of the Great Lakes?
Just a moment. From South America, looking into North America, they saw the plumed serpent. In Ohio, standing under that discharge, they saw the snake. All of these are in our mythology and in our literature.
Mm-hmm.
The snake in Ohio is a representation of the gun diode discharge that formed the Great Lakes and the St. Lawrence Seaway. And it's aligned with the solstices because it is aligned to show us the date that the event occurred on, which is this winter solstice that we celebrate. All of these are in the mythology for a reason. In fact, there's a story that Manly P. Hall has told. I'm still looking for a direct source of this, but Hall says that the name for America is actually America, and it's a South American indigenous name for North America, and Amaruca means land of the plumed serpent. From South America looking north.
It's Amaru.
A giant plumed serpent, as the discharge and the current flow created this arcing of the Thunderbird for people looking at it from the front. From the side, it was a plumed serpent. Again, the mythology supports that there was something here that occurred. And if you look at the Great Lakes, just step back and look at the Great Lakes, you'll see it's a bird. And that's
what is the significance of the Great Lakes looking like a bird from up high? I mean, I completely understand the concept of plasma discharge forming shapes in the sky that a variety of people see. I mean, the Thunderbolts Project has done an excellent job of demonstrating this again and again, and it provides a great basis to explain petroglyphs that appear around the world that are the same shapes. But
how we just had a conference on it.
Great Lakes looking like this Thunderbird.
So
and how would anybody have known that?
Well, you know, that's just it. Is when these people etched this into the rock, and when they later went to the site at Devil's Lake and actually created the rock effigy, what they were trying to explain was that something happened so incredible that they actually took the time to chisel it into the stone and immortalize it. That they did that should give us pause to say, look, we have to have an explanation for why they did it. Across the entire Western US, people didn't just suddenly walk up to a rock and go, hey, this looks kind of cool. Let's just do this.
That's what I was just talking about. I completely recognize that. Something very significant happened. People saw it. They carved it into the rock.
Yes. And so if you look at the Great Lakes, you can actually identify the rudimentary parts of the Thunderbird, including in a number of tales. It talks about the Thunderbird fighting with the whale, one or two whales, lifting the whales up and down. In a memristor circuitry, in a gun diode, there's actually an area of the diode that is a heat sink. It dissipates heat, it picks it up and lets it go. And that is the description of the Thunderbird lifting and dropping the whales during the cataclysm. Again, we're looking for fidelity in these stories because they.
Dude, I really need to interject here. I have no idea what the fuck you're talking about. It's certainly not scientific. It's completely esoteric nonsense, and it has nothing to do with what we initially started talking about. Well, you've explained away from the beginning of your theory, and there's no cosmogenic signatures, and you poo-pooed what we said, and you said, no, I have this paper that says a shape claims it's an impact. Well, you can claim that Nibiru is floating around. You can claim the earth is flat, but when you start with a hypothesis, then it needs to be challenged. And Lee and I challenged you deeply. And you just change the subject time and time again. And you go on into these tangents. And Leah keeps asking you, how in the world would they be able to make a petroglyph of a Thunderbird if you're saying the Thunderbird is only visual from space? So you keep avoiding the obvious, that everything you're claiming is not supported by any practical evidence. And let me explain science to you. You come up with a hypothesis like Firestone did in 2007. He said, I think there was a comet and a cosmic event, and I have evidence for it. And everyone said, no. And then they went out and looked, and all the evidence started coming in. It took decades. And all the evidence supports now one area of some kind of cosmogenic impactor region. And you go off on a tangent showing like circles and impacts that have nothing to do with 12,832 years ago. And we're doing a podcast with you on this, and you just keep going on tangents about nothing. And so I want to know, what is your point, Robert? Are you a real scientist, or are you just like dabbling in nonsensical shit? Because this really needs to go somewhere. And I don't want to seem like an idiot or like I'm shutting you down. Leah, is anything I've said incorrect?
Yeah, it's largely correct. I mean, I'll just give one example. When we were talking about the Thunderbird thing, you have explained that people were aware of the Thunderbird because it would have been appearing in the sky in terms of plasma, which I totally understand, and I agree with the concept on. My question is, how did people see that the Great Lakes formed a Thunderbird shape? How would they have seen that unless they were flying in the sky? Because you've made great significance about this Thunderbird shape of those lakes. So how is that? How would the shape of the lakes be connected to the Thunderbird myth? Because you seem to be suggesting that that is the case. So I'm saying, how is that the case? But you have not answered my question. So, and that's an example of, I think, what Diamond is expressing, is that we're asking specific questions, and instead of answering those questions, you're talking about something else.
Well, thank you, Leanne. I appreciate that. What I'm trying to describe here, and what is finding perhaps some challenge and acceptance, is that we are looking at an electrical circuit. And this is science, and this is pretty standard science. And in all electrical science, we're really dealing with two things. We're dealing with a positive, and we're dealing with a negative.
Okay, so you don't need to explain this. I studied physics in college. You don't need to explain this.
Okay.
Like the basic science we completely understand. We both have science backgrounds. We've both, been in the university system in that regard. So it's a matter of, like, we're asking very pointed, specific questions about what you're postulating, and those questions are not being answered.
Well, I would argue that I've answered them, and that because we...
No. Let me answer specifically. Why are there no cosmogenic signatures in the Himalayas, in your basin, which is a flat-lying sedimentary basin, which has no evidence of impact? Why is that an impact? And don't say the shape again, because that is not evidence. That is that is like third grade stuff. There needs to be evidence of an impact, which means you need cosmogenic signatures, not a shape. So let's not, other than the shape, which is not evidence of an impact unless you have extracurricular supporting corroborating data. Where is your corroborating data on top of the shape on your impact? That's the first question. Where is it?
Well, I would argue that, once again, the evidence is in Mount Everest, and it's...
Everest does not have any impact precursors on it. There are no microspherules. There is no beryllium-10. There is no evidence that Everest has anything to do with an impact. So where is your evidence? And don't say Mount Everest again, because it's not evidence.
Well, the second piece of evidence I gave you were the Lichtenberg structures of the mountain region.
And Leah and I know Lichtenberg structures you can burn into wood if you've got a thing. But those Lichtenberg structures are not dated to the Younger Dryas or an impact.
David, if I can replicate what happened, how is that not science? Isn't that the point of science?
What do you mean you can replicate what?
I can replicate the formation of our river systems using electrical...
You see, you're deflecting. This has nothing to do with the cosmogenic precursors on your impact. If you can replicate a river system. So this might have been a better podcast if you wanted to discuss electric discharge formations on Earth as they relate to geology. But this certainly has nothing to do... Your hypothesis has nothing to do with the Younger Dryas impact, because there's clear evidence that it didn't happen in the Himalayas, and the Himalayas have nothing to do with it. How would you respond to that?
Well, once again,
How would you respond to all of the data that is not in the Himalayas? Why is it that there? You think that it's like from the trail of it, and then when the main event happened in the Himalayas, there was no cosmogenic signatures? That is not science. That's not even plausible. Based on scientific fact, your theory is not even plausible, so it gets destroyed right here in this podcast.
Well, I appreciate your evaluation on that.
It's not an evaluation. This is science. This is any other scientist, based on what all was discussed, would come to the same conclusion, but you.
Well, I would argue that I've given you location. I've given you the paper that talks about what the location.
You haven't given any evidence. You keep circling back about nothing.
I've given multiple examples of electrical formations that show you the circuit in action.
My goodness.
And that we have differing theories on this, but there seems to be some pushback on whether or not the impact crater is an impact crater. And so
it's not pushback. This is basic science. Your theory does not hold weight in this simple 1 hour. You have no evidence to support your impact hypothesis except the shape. And when you just look at the younger Dryas impact hypothesis, there are over 100 scientists that have dedicated thousands of hours to determining a specific area of cosmogenic influence on Earth. And they have delineated that to a very specific region, which is outside of your impact. So your theory at this point, based on science, holds zero weight, period. Leah, would you please?
I was just going to go back to something that I said earlier in the podcast. I was talking about the Ozarks. And when you look at the Ozarks from space, they certainly do present like a Lichtenberg structure, which is very interesting because my first thought is, okay, this is quite possibly an event of plasma scarring. But I cannot come to the conclusion that that is the case until I were to actually, well, I'm not even going to say not even me, because I'm not a geologist and I don't have the background knowledge to do so. But until a geologist went to the Ozarks and started looking for that cosmogenic evidence, I wouldn't make that claim. I would say that it's possible, but I cannot conclude that. So again, shape, for example, shape alone cannot make that determination because there are other factors involved. And when those factors are missing, then we have to assume that this structure is the result of something else.
So when we look at this from an electrical standpoint, and we look at the Ozarks, for example, and David, if it's at all possible for you to bring up North America, just in general, on Google Earth, one of the things that we have to note about that formation area is that it's actually a mirror. There are actually a pair of wings like this in North America. And you can see that because you can look at the Hudson Bay, and then there's another bay on the Hudson Bay like this, and this is called St. James Bay. And St. James Bay is actually the exact same size, the exact same orientation, and it's actually directly aligned with Florida. And that's because when we look at this from a wing standpoint, it's a mirrored wing standpoint like that. And they're identical because they formed the two sides of a magnetic field that's very predictable when you have a current flowing. When current is flowing in a direction, around the current, you will have a magnetic field of induction that's formed. And that's what you're looking at, is that magnetic field of induction. That's why these two sides look exactly the same, with Florida being the St. James Bay. They were synonymous in their formation because one is a negative discharge and the other one is part of the positive discharge. And the Ozarks are part of that matching arc, if you will.
I mean, again, we can look at shapes on the Earth all day long. And
evidence.
I have no idea what he just said, by the way.
I mean, we can look at
right there, David. Go back and scroll in just a little closer.
Yeah, you're talking shapes and looking at the planet. We came into this with your theory of the younger Dryas impact being an impact structure in the Himalayas. And now we're looking at North America and some esoteric thing you're trying to show us that has
Well,
no relation to your initial hypothesis.
there's
And the
nothing.
fact that you haven't answered a single question about why there are no cosmogenic signatures in your region, and that hundreds of scientists have spent decades researching the specific stratigraphic layer at 12,830 to specify and to find these precursors, and why you continue to go on. I don't understand it, Robert.
Well, for one, I found some pretty incredible information and some.
These all might be electric discharge features, but none of them have anything to do with the Younger Dryas. Leah, would you agree with me?
Yeah, I agree with that.
Well, I'm glad.
We're way outside of Younger Dryas here.
Yeah, so we're just now talking esoterically about what may be driving the plate tectonic idea that is completely incorrect. And I believe that it has to do with magnetic excursions that allow more induction in the asthenosphere and maybe some slippage or increased plate tectonics, when what we learn about uniformitarianism is that these mountains are moving at 1 or 2 inches a year, and we can calculate that now. But I think that is the aftershock effect. So the earthquakes that are happening now in the New Madrid region are the aftershocks of the 1700 earthquake. It's that extensive. And so when we see mountain building rates that we're calculating now in a quiet time on Earth, all we're seeing is the residual effect of the accelerated processes that created them. So when they're saying the Himalayas are going up 2 inches a year or whatever, no, they went up thousands of feet a decade for a very short period of time during these catastrophes. And so what we're looking at here may or may not be accentuated, because all of these effects, the speeding up of plate tectonics, is caused by reduced magnetic field, increased induction from space through the auroral belts, and the charging of the planet. We know that all earthquakes are caused by electrochemical discharge in the telluric currents. There are precursors. There are electromagnetic waves that come. We now know that the poles are heating 4 times faster than the rest of the Earth. That's because the magnetosphere has waned 30% since about 1800. And so we know these things. This is all new science. And so a lot of the plasma discharge, quote unquote, features might be a very long term in terms of, rather than geologically instantaneous, let's say decades, with increased aurora and charging of the planet, with increased continental crust slip, we can get some of these types of thunderbolt patterns and positive and negative whirls. And you can also find these on other planets, but none of this has to do with the Younger Dryas event.
Well, no, it actually all has to do with, the thing is.
No, it doesn't. And I can prove it to you, Robert, because in the last 5 million years, the Younger Dryas event is the most significant cosmogenic event in the entire ice core data. There is no other event like it. So it's completely
Simon, why don't you pull up the graph that shows like the platinum spike and all of that?
Yeah, I have it here. It's the most unique event in 5 million years cosmogenically. So there's no recurring event like some people claim every 12,000 years something happens. This event is equally as impressive as the Cretaceous Tertiary boundary. In fact, some of the proxies are that specific, that there are only 2 times in Earth's history that they've occurred: the Younger Dryas and the end of the dinosaurs. So that's how significant it is. And if you look at the beryllium 10 alone, the Younger Dryas event is the most significant since about 5 million years ago, which was the last extinction event, which kicked off the Pleistocene and the Ice Age, so-called. So the Younger Dryas event is not an insignificant event, and the amount of scientists working on it is completely insane. It is one of the most studied events in geologic history at this time. Right now, there are probably 500 scientists at university working on it.
I'm sure there are a lot, and if they aren't looking at this from an electrical eyeball, which I doubt very many of them are, then they're
no, some of them are.
Well, if they are, then that's good. What we're really talking about here when we're looking at the bigger picture, right, is the question of whose model explains everything better. And I don't have to win a debate with you guys here tonight. I was just very pleased to have an opportunity to have a conversation about this. What I would say is I would say that within any conversation that we're going to have, it would probably be beneficial for us to begin with a simple structure of what data is acceptable and what can we use. Because if you can't use peer-reviewed papers on what a near impact site should look like, if I can't use
No, you don't get it.
No,
Then
nobody
you
said you
don't
can't
get
use
it.
Lichtenberg figures, I guess I just don't understand what
Robert, you don't get it. You're using a general paper on what the shape of an impact looks like. That's like third grade science. So
Yeah.
then if you determine you found a shape that looks like an impact, then you look for all these proxies that I'm showing you here. You look for a platinum spike. You look for NH. You look for an ammonium spike. You look for CO2 spikes.
You look for a carbon 14 spike.
Yeah, carbon 14. You look for spikes in everything that's cosmogenic, and you haven't looked for any of that.
No,
It's not that the shape is irrelevant, because it's not irrelevant. It is relevant. It's just that you need the additional data to really determine what that structure is.
Well, arguably, I've looked at much of that data, and I do understand what you're describing, and especially when you talk about, if I understand what cosmogenic data is, I understand what you're talking about. I agree that the data that you have is very good. What I'm arguing is that you don't
Robert, it's exactly what you are saying. Cosmogenic data is what happens during plasma discharge events. Objects don't have to hit the ground. It's when objects in near proximity come to Earth and there's a discharge, they leave these signatures of beryllium, microspherules, nanodiamonds. It doesn't even have to be an impactor. It could be a lightning bolt from space. There could be no object. But if it hit in the Himalayas, there would be proxy data, and there is none. There is only this data that we have up on the screen here in the Younger Dryas impact field. That's the only place on Earth it exists.
So one of the data points that I spent some time looking at was what we call the Lechamp excursion, right? So we're supposed to have this, multi-thousand year, slowdown in our electromagnetic field. And at one point, the electromagnetic field, the magnetosphere of the Earth was supposed to have gotten to 4%. And then over the next period of years, it goes back up again. And what's so ridiculous about the idea that this happened over a long period is that if our magnetosphere had reached 4% for any length of time, and by any, I mean weeks, everybody on Earth would have died of radiation. That's just a science fact. What the Lechamp?
Yeah, that's exactly what happened at the Lechamp, Robert. That's 98% of all surface life died. The only thing that survived was the life in the oceans, a few humans. It's estimated to be less than 10,000, when at that time there could have been hundreds of millions, and very few mammals. The Lechamp was one of the biggest pinch points in paleontological history for the last 65 million years. It was the lowest VADM. It was the lowest field intensity on Earth, measured by thousands of proxies anywhere in the rock record. It is the most significant event ever recorded in geologic history since the extinction of the dinosaurs. Other than the Mahanis Brunus polar reversal 780,000 years ago, which barely did anything. So the Lechamp magnetic excursion is more impressive because it lasted a long time. People had to literally hide underground. If they came out during the day, they would die. Their hair would fall out. This is what we know from all the scientific papers, clearly, that you haven't read.
Very good. Very good. If I could finish on the Lechamp. What the Lechamp excursion is showing is the magnetic field during the discharge as it went through all of the layers of the surface of the Earth. It's like a snapshot in time. And since the field, the field size is so large, right, it permeated all of the layers. And because it permeated, what we look at in that magnetic signature of the Lechamp excursion is the discharge coming in and going out. It's a discharge marking through the strata, not while the strata was being formed.
So where is the evidence of that going through all of the strata? How do we prove that? What's the evidence of that?
Goes through all the strata right now. That's how we prove it. And we're talking about a hypercharged event, a high electric event, and all electrical events are lines of current. So it's all about the electricity going through. And any large discharge will create a large pulse, an EMP. And this is in a lot of ways what you're talking about, David. This EMP is part of what resulted in all of the spherical diamonds, all of these berylliums, all of this pulsated through the entire magnetosphere of the planet. You go, beryllium has to be formed in space. Yeah, brah, I'm connected in the Earth.
Then why don't we find why do we not find beryllium-10 everywhere on Earth then? Because we don't.
Well,
there's only one stable isotope of beryllium, and it's beryllium-9 on the surface. Beryllium-10 only gets created from cosmic rays during low field intensity. So the Lechamp was the highest beryllium-10 deposition on Earth in the last 65 million years. And then subsequent to that, the second highest is the Younger Dryas event. Now, what's different with the Lechamp is there are no impact proxies. There are no microspherules. There are no craters. There are no shocked quartz. So clearly the Lechamp is what happens when the magnetic field of Earth is reduced to almost nothing and the sun just continues to operate as normal. Any coronal mass ejection, even a C flare, if our field was reduced that much, would make the hair on a human fall out. So,
I'm in full
and on top of that, it's going to also rain in UVA, UVB, and C. So if you go out during the day, you're dead. And that's why we have a mass extinction of all surface megafauna that need to feed during the day. So all the animals that are feeding in grass fields all die off, and most of the humans. Same thing happened during the Younger Dryas. Now, luckily, the bison lived and the mammoth died off because the bison are migratory. So there are millions of bison that were out of the area that were able to migrate back in and feed on the grasses once the rains began.
So one of the things that we talk about in terms of catastrophism or a cataclysm, right, is we talk about changes that happen on the Earth. And one of the things that needs to be acknowledged is that the idea of raising a dinosaur, right, from the dead is not just farcical, but ludicrous. The largest animal on the planet today is the elephant. And at its largest, it's about 16,000 pounds, right? These dinosaurs that were 3 and 4 and 5 times the size of an elephant could have never existed, could never have existed on the Earth as it exists today. And what that means is it means that what we call gravity, which is a mislabeling of the dielectric force, what we call gravity today had to have been much lower. And in order for that to be true,
gravity is bullshit, Robert. So apparently you haven't watched our show. The Earth was much thinner in diameter. It was much smaller. So the whole plate tectonic theory, if you go back to Pangea, what you would have is an entire planet our size with one continent on one side and the rest of the planet with ocean. That's completely nonsensical. So the whole idea of our planet being one size for the last 5 billion years since it was formed is complete nonsense. It was a small ball, and it's been slowly expanding. So when we go back to the time of the dinosaurs, when the explosion happened in the Triassic, if you look at the plate tectonics and you reverse the planet backwards, it's literally less than 1/3 of the size. So if you're using electric universe, what you're going to have is a much more, you're going to have 3 times more magnetic repulsion or sticking to the surface, in other words. So you can easily get a dinosaur with a heart up in its head at this time if you shrink the Earth. If you keep the Earth at the same size, then there are dozens of papers that prove there's no way, based on the gravitational constant that we have now, that blood could be pumped up there. So either gravity's bullshit or the earth was smaller. There's almost no other explanation.
To be fair, Robert did say that gravity was basically bullshit. Didn't you just say that it's basically a misnomer?
So what we're looking at here, and the reason I bring this up is because if we look at this from a single cataclysm standpoint, the ending of the megaflora and the megafauna are explainable first from
which ending? The Younger Dryas ending?
So, David, let me speak for a moment. So if we look at the extinction of megaflora and the megafauna from a cataclysm standpoint, right, it would explain things like why none of the megaflora and none of the megafauna residue, any of the bones or anything, are found, for example, inside the Grand Canyon. They existed before the Grand Canyon formed. They've never found a megaflora or a megafauna artifact in the Grand Canyon. So when we look at that, just kind of a piece of data, right, we can then ask ourselves, what else might be true about that? And the answer is that not only was the
Robert, the stratigraphic record in the Grand Canyon goes from 4 billion years ago to present.
Let's just go.
So I have no idea what you're talking about. David, what are you talking about? What are you talking about? Megaflora and fauna.
Megafauna in the Grand Canyon.
What are you talking about? You're not making any sense. Growing there?
No. So you won't find any giant three-toed sloth. You won't find any giant bear. You won't find any megafauna or any megaflora inside the Grand Canyon. There is no evidence whatsoever that they ever inhabited that area, which means that they either didn't inhabit the area.
So we're talking about the Younger Dryas extinction, right? Correct?
What's that?
You're talking about the extinction at the Younger Dryas.
The extinction.
That's all I was getting at. That's how clueless you are.
The first part that happened was that the populations were devastated by the cataclysm. We see this in the frozen mammoth that were frozen within 3 or 4 hours. They were frozen so quickly and so thoroughly that the temperatures had to have reached -2, 3, and even 400 degrees for them to have frozen that quickly. In order for that to happen, you have to have a massive transfer.
Robert, everything you're saying is complete conjecture and bullshit. Okay. Well, and let me tell you why. Because I have extensive knowledge about frozen mammoths, and not a single one is even close to the Younger Dryas. The most famous frozen mammoth is 44,000 years ago. And all of them date between 28 and 60,000 years ago. Not a single frozen mammoth happened during the Younger Dryas. This is a misnomer that's been spread around the internet and picked up by non-scientist charlatans, and they repeat it because they don't look at the papers. So there are mammoths being flash frozen 48,000 years ago, 42,000 years ago during the Lechamp, 28,000 years ago, at all points during the Ice Age. They didn't all freeze none of them froze. There's not a single mammoth with a date anywhere close to 13 to 11.5. None. Those are facts.
The facts are that the flush shows that they froze near instantly. And we have confirmation of that.
It's not true. It's not true. Every single archaeological paper shows they were buried in a landslide. They're all deformed and they're stretched and they're covered in anoxic sediments. So they were buried in the Arctic during a flood and they were frozen there and stayed there until they're being now during the Holocene. They're now coming out because it's warm. They were frozen. Do you know that the Ice Age lasted from 88,000 years ago until just 13,000 years ago? That's how long it was. So during that time, things were frozen in anoxic environments, not fossilized, and just now being unearthed due to thawing because it's warm out.
I mean, again, it's a theory and it's a thesis and we should examine it.
They're not theories, dude.
I have a giant round circle in the Hudson Bay.
So your theory is that all the dating is wrong and that all the mammoths got frozen in your event where there's no evidence for it. Is that your theory, that all the mammoths were flash frozen during your Thunderbird event in the up in the Great Lakes that impacted the Himalayas and froze the mammoths in the Arctic? That's your theory, and during the Younger Dryas, based on no evidence that you've supplied us.
I've actually supplied a fair amount, but I can bring in some more information, some more ideas.
Leah, what evidence has he brought to support his theory?
I'm not hearing it, to be honest. I'm sorry, Robert. Perhaps we should wrap this up because we're kind of going in circles now.
Final words, Robert.
Well, one, thank you very much for taking the time to do an interview with me on this. It's always nice to exchange ideas and information. I would suggest that your viewers and your subscribers, if they would like to take some time, could visit my channel and do their own research into what I'm doing. I try very hard to source my materials. I try very hard to show in good illustrations what I'm talking about that I see. And I believe that I have firmly found the near impact site of a cataclysm about 12,900 years ago with Venus.
Leah?
I think, we just can't eliminate the importance of how we develop and test our theories, right? So for every hypothesis that comes along, we really need to go look for the evidence that really supports that hypothesis. And I just feel like that's what we're missing here. I completely understand getting excited about seeing a certain structure on the Earth, recognizing it as let's say, a possible electrical discharge event. But then that idea has to be backed up with evidence, and that's what we're lacking here. And we're specifically citing evidence that presents with very similar phenomena that we would expect to see for something like that, and we're just not seeing it here, and that's really the issue. And that's what science is about at the end of the day.
Yeah, I appreciate you coming on, Robert. This is a very tough crew. I'm one of the most critical scientists in the entire world. And I don't take no for an answer because I like to get to the bottom of it. Now, I like you, found the electric universe through serendipitous ways. And I like to listen to what Andy Hall has to say. The only problem is that all of his fantasies are based on shapes and electric discharge phenomenon. Now, here's the funny thing. You said Mr. Too Tough. We all know who he is. He's been doing experiments in the lab, plasma discharge experiments, for over a decade. And his conclusions are that when you do electrify these regions and create these structures that may be the Badlands or maybe any of Andy Hall's structures or any of the Thunderbolt structures that are continent-wide that you show, there would be evidence of plasma discharge, microspherules, and everything else associated with that. And there is not. That's the evidence that's lacking. So that's when I pushed back from the whole Thunderbolts idea and said, let me dive into the literature. I'm a scientist at heart. I began it in academia in the 80s. I was introduced to the fact that funding wasn't available if you wanted to do real science because I'm a stratigrapher and a paleontologist. And in 3 or 4 years, I knew quite readily that there is no evolution. All that there is in the rock record is abrupt ends and abrupt changes across a boundary. And so when I looked in the stratigraphy, I immediately saw that the Earth for the last 3 billion years was nothing but catastrophe after catastrophe after catastrophe. And it was a hierarchic catastrophe. It was nested. There were 100,000 year cycles, 400,000 year cycles, 2 million year cycles, but there was a pervasive cycle around 25,000 years that did not stop ever for the entirety of all of stratigraphy. And it's baffling. Sometimes they're big and sometimes they're small, but there's always a sea level rise and fall on Earth whether it be the plates expanding or falling or the oceans rising and falling, this catastrophe has been happening for hundreds of millions of years, and no one has an answer. Not a single person. It happened during the time of the dinosaurs when we know gravity doesn't work. So it has to happen at all times. Maybe when the earth was expanding it is completely baffling. But the only way you can get to the bottom of it is using the scientific method. If you have a hypothesis, like Leah said, you need to test it. And tonight we tested your hypothesis, and I don't think it held up to weight. It's not to poo-poo you. It's to make you dive in and dig deeper and look for the cosmogenic signatures in the Himalayas. And I unfortunately don't think you'll find them. But what you might be revealed from this is that maybe it's from a different event, something else that happened, that it could be related to the electric universe theory.
I mean, one of the beautiful things, and you sort of already said this, Robert, about electric universe theory, is simply that it is scalable. You know, the same patterns emerge on the microscopic level, I'll call it the medium level, and the macro level. And that is just gorgeous. I mean, it used to drive me absolutely crazy that physics has now been divided into all of these different segments. I've got quantum mechanics over here to talk about the micro level. I've got relativity to talk about the macro level, and none of it fits together. It drives me insane. And so when I learned about electric universe theory, it really blew my mind, because it really does an amazingly cohesive job to talk about the structure of how things happen on every level. However, it's not the only thing that's happening, and it does still require evidence to show that this structure over here is an electrical discharge event, and this one over here is. We can't just literally apply it to everything and have it explain everything. I mean, maybe the actual structure of everything, but
we're gonna have Robert's YouTube channel link below. I think it's just called Robert.
It is.
Yeah.
Lucky
and
you.
It doesn't have much traction. If all the people that watch this podcast just go over and subscribe to Robert, he will have 5,000 subscribers in about 3 days.
Beautiful.
And you got some, you don't just talk about this. You're more into the electric universe idea. So you talk about other topics, correct?
I do. I cover the extraterrestrial alien connection question. You know, one of the things that I think is interesting in the work of Tom DeLonge that he's going through right now is
isn't that crazy?
Yeah, you know, and he has a slightly different take on what's going on. And he said in an interview recently that what's happening with the UFO, the UAP phenomenon, is that they're not coming from a different planet. And that changes the way you look at the entire question of what's happening here on Earth. And so I cover that question as well, and do so, I think, in a unique way.
That's pretty awesome. I think, well, and many of us who've done research on that topic, I don't know about your thoughts, Leah, but simply that from the archaeological standpoint, that there were multiple vehicles found in antiquity, that we've been doing reverse engineering based on the Bob Lazar story, and that there is some secret compartmentalized information. And look, and if you just dive into the extraterrestrial subject, a good friend of the channel wrote the book called The Type 5. If you reach the next level, and there are 3 other levels above that, there is no reason you're abducting humans and need to do any of that. You are interdimensional. I mean, literally, you know everything about anything. There's no reason you need an anal probe. You could be on like the Pleiades and anal probe a human. I mean, it's that stupid. The whole twisting of the UFO phenomenon is so bizarre.
Well, you know, I would argue that one of the smartest things that I've heard said was from a gentleman by the name of David Jacobs, Dr. David Jacobs. He was a regressor for people of the abduction phenomenon. And he called my attention one day when he said, you know, these ships are made for this purpose. When they come here, they're made for the abduction and for the medical procedures that they do. And he said, that's indicative of a program. And when you look at what's going on, the question really comes down to one of genetics, right? Because the abduction phenomenon is quite clearly about genetics. People are saying, I have fetuses, I have tests that show I'm pregnant, I have sonograms that show that there was a baby there, and then nothing, and no residuals. So it's you have to dig into some of the crazy stuff in order to just kind of get your hands around what's really going on. And one thing Tom said that I like is that what's going on now has been going on the entire time, which means that in any theory of everything, that should fit into the discussion as well.
Yeah, I'm very pro genetic engineering of humans in antiquity.
Yeah, it does seem to be the case.
That's
Well,
a
I mean,
weird
it's happening
sentence in and of
now
itself.
with crops and trees. So, and what we know based on history and hidden history is that they knew how to do extractions, teeth extractions 5,000 years ago. They knew how to do amputations 40,000 years ago, and the subject lived for 9 more years. I mean, this is a new paper that came out this year. It was a clean cut. Clearly, it was a surgeon. He knew what he was doing. He cauterized the wound, and the guy lived for another decade. And that's still like past the average age of that time. So we don't know anything.
There's so much evidence of humans doing highly advanced things, long before we were. And there's a lot of potential explanations for why that might be. And perhaps aliens is part of the equation.
Well, we don't even have to say aliens. The argument right now is one of what we call ultra-terrestrials, which is to say that there's someone else here, and we're not the apex, character on the block. And that would explain, if there is a genetic program going on, that there would be a level of control. There is a level of interaction that goes above us. That is to say, we may not be able to quite understand what that's all about. But we can engage with the information and begin understanding. And I think that's sort of what we're sort of at the cornerstones of.
Yeah. Homo sapien brain function is less than 40%. It's around 32%. And so if you just look at the cosmic wheel and the great year, and the fact that the civilization that was before the Younger Dryas knew of the great year, and it's now ingrained in all of the megalithic architecture. And that comes from the work of Hamlet's Mill that you provided and the work of von Deschen. It's clear that these aren't the first people that knew about it. They were engineering it into the structures. So it's the civilization, the pre-diluvians, that knew of this. They were world travelers. No one knows why they didn't have a language. Well, I do. It's called telepathy. So there's the golden age and the silver, right? And the dark age. And so why can't you have advanced cultures that are megalithic, writing something down is stupid. If you and I can just look at each other and communicate, can you imagine if we then decided to write stuff down on paper and stuff we had to throw out? That is so stupid. If the perfect human or community would be just people in harmony, like looking at each other and understanding and working together, it would be completely harmonious, which is the exact opposite of basically where we are now.
Well, yeah, there's just so many structures around the world that when you look at them and you understand the nature of electromagnetism, you understand that what these structures really were doing, the pyramids at Giza, you have these structures in, in Asia, right? You have pyramids in China, right? All of these are accessing electromagnetic forces of the earth. And in order to do that, you have to have an understanding of what electromagnetism is. And that's one of the reasons why the Hamlet's Mill thesis is so important, is it says, look, these myths aren't just wild fabrications. There is a rhyme and a reason through each of these that if we can decode it, that is to say, if we can translate it, we can harvest the information out of it. And there are a lot of very interesting stories that talk about the cataclysm, but there's also the stories of of Tiamat and Marduk, and of the origin stories of Enki and Enlil. And all of these have to do with the origins, I believe, of humans on Earth today.
Well, the origin story of Enki and Enlil is the Younger Dryas event, and it is the comet Enki in the Torrid stream that was the major original. It just like the fact that if you go into the esoteric and you start to research the fact, like, where did we come up with the quadratic system of breaking up time and space into 4 points? This is the same X that is the Christian cross. It is the same as the Gothic cross. It is the same as the cosmic catastrophe cross of the great year. The great year has 4 seasons that happen every 6,600 years. This is not new information. This has been passed on past that flexure point at the Younger Dryas event. And this comes through in the work of Von Deschen and Hamlet's Mill. Clearly, these cultures didn't just learn that. They intrinsically engineered it into their buildings. So why? And literally, in order for them to build it into their buildings in antiquity like they did, you had to be watching the heavens for at least, at a minimum, 26,000 years to determine the precession is occurring, which means that every year you wake up and you look, you're like, wait a minute, the stars are a little late and they take 1 degree to get to me. And then even after 1,000 years, you're only looking at a little span of it, and how you can put the picture together that it is astrology. And it is absolutely the astrological wheel, which we now call like pseudoscience, is completely bizarre. This science came from 40,000 plus years ago. There is proof in Lascaux caves that they knew of all the constellations, the astrological wheel, and the precession of the equinoxes. So why can't we then say that Sacsayhuaman in South America could be 42,000 years ago? Why can't the pyramids, the base, or the entire structure be 42,000 years old? Because they all meet the criteria with the precession of the equinoxes embedded in it. I mean, the distance to the sun is embedded in the pyramid. The distance to the moon, the lunar diameter, all of the critical dimensions are within the engineering of all the ancient megaliths. And yet, when we go through school and public school, when you go to university, I didn't know any of this. And this is the most critical information that anyone could know.
Yeah. Yeah. You can't really understand where we are today if you still have the belief system that 5,000 or 8,000 years ago, the only people on Earth were living in the prairies with spears and running around barefoot and naked. And if that's what you believe there was on Earth, then you're woefully going to be unprepared to understand the true history of our planet. That's for sure.
You know, and one of the most extraordinary things about all of that knowledge that's embedded in our buildings, all of the information that was collected over the course of 26,000 years, it had to be passed from generation to generation. That alone is such an extraordinary feat. And here we are today claiming that the people behind us were just like dumb cavemen or something. It's just so ridiculous, and it's insulting, frankly. And it suggests that we don't really think very much of ourselves, I think.
Yeah, it strains credulity quite often. When you look at you look just, for example, at Nan Madol in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, right? And so the myth of Nan Madol says that twin brothers, Elisapa and Elosapa, showed up. They set up an altar to the agricultural god, I believe was the first one, and then they failed. But eventually they start a new machine up, and a dragon flies through the air, and the dragon, they say, is who's responsible for building all of the structures at Nan Madol. And what's amazing is, one, this is the middle of the Pacific Ocean. How are we talking about dragons? Are dragons that common that even in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, that's what we get here? And then two, the intricate work of that entire complex and using the hexagonal stones speaks of somebody who had access to something that could move the stones and an understanding of how to create the building structures themselves that was well out of place for Polynesians running around in canoes and catamaran sailboats. How do you do this? Well, you have to have an understanding that was beyond what you might conceive of that time in history.
Well, it's easy to deceive in archaeology and in funding. For the last several decades, people have been deceived. And specifically, when you're talking Nan Madol, all of the Pacific Rim. And if you go to Easter Island, what people don't realize is that there are hundreds of moai on Easter Island, correct? There's only 12 that are carved from basalt. The rest are from the soft tuff, from the quarry that's there, that they can walk down to the shore and move around. So the recent culture that was on Easter Island that were surrounded by the 12 basaltic moai that were maybe 15,000 years old or older, they revered them as gods. And then they found this salt tuff quarry and they started carving them. They made hundreds of them. They cut down all the trees to get them to the shore. And then they screwed up. They were not that smart. But the people that built the first 12 basaltic moai that are buried 45 feet deep, still sitting vertical in the sediment, and that Thor Heyerdahl exposed, that have the same fingers that the pillar stones in Göbekli Tepe have, and the same fingers that are found worldwide in megalithic cultures. This is pre-Diluvian. This is a culture that's worldwide, that has a map, it travels around like nobody's business, and everyone is practicing the same principles. And these are all very specific. Astroarchaeological, they're so specific. They know, like, if you think the Masons are impressive, these are dry set masons doing some of the most impressive. I was a dry set mason for 8 years. I moved tens of thousands of tons of rock, building beautiful walls for rich people. And I'm sure those walls are still sitting there, because if you know how you're setting them, now the reason they made them so big is because they knew what was coming. And no one gets that.
Sure. Arguably.
Leah, let's finish with some kind words for Robert. Robert, I can't believe you made it through the assault. But we appreciate you, because the only way we're going to get somewhere is if we get somewhere.
That's right.
Yeah.
I was going to say
the time to be on.
I was going to say something similar. Robert, thank you for withstanding that sort of hailstorm of criticism. You're a champ for withstanding that.
Well, thank you guys. It was you had some great questions, and you did challenge the information, as you should. And it's always good to have an exchange with people and to get new ideas. And maybe we can get together again and do this somewhere down the road.
Yeah, dive into the research into your area. Look for some cosmogenic signatures, maybe some alternative hypotheses. Whatever it is, the only way we can move science forward is to move it forward. You know what I'm saying? When they say global warming is scientific law due to consensus, that is the antithesis of science. What do you think, Robert? Global warming?
Well, I agree with the idea that the solar system is an electrical circuit. And I'm actually of the mind that the use of redshift to give us distances to other celestial bodies is an inaccurate way to measure. And I say that because we've experienced multiple floods over the time. And there seems to be somewhere around the 1300s, right when the Crab Nebula exploded, there seems to be this migration of people. And so it happened in South America, it happened in other places. And so it makes me wonder whether or not
that could be the mud floods
are triggered by these electrical discharges that are coming across the galactic current, if you will. And so understanding what's happening on these larger events in terms of the electrical currents always help us to get a better idea of the world that we live in particular, the catastrophes that we face, and the global warming, well, the change in temperature that's more electrical in nature than it is from us polluting the environment.
Yeah, are you familiar with the cloud experiment at CERN?
I don't know off the top of my head that I've read it, but if you'd like to share.
Look into the work of Svensmark and cosmic rays, nucleating clouds, and the fact that the federal government and governments worldwide teamed up to disprove him, and they proved him correct. The cloud experiment at CERN. And so what it proves is that when the magnetosphere wanes on Earth, we have increased cosmic ray nucleation, increased flooding, increased rains. And that's what's been happening over the last several decades. These 1,000-year floods that are unexplainable due to climate change is because of cosmic rays, which is changing the climate, but it's not because of you. It's the sun.
Yeah, agreed.
Yep. Thanks
And
for
all
watching.
of
Thanks
that-
for coming on. Go ahead, Leah.
Thank you for coming on, Robert.
Yeah, check out Robert's channel. It's just called Robert, and it'll be linked below. Be safe. We love you all. That's boom.